There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Not the ones you see coming, the graduations, the weddings, the carefully planned milestones. The ones that matter most arrive without warning, dressed in ordinary clothes, sitting across from you at a dinner table in a restaurant that charges $40 for a glass of wine. This was one of those moments. The restaurant was called Arden, tucked into the ground floor of a renovated building on 5th Avenue North in downtown Nashville. The kind of place where the lighting is always just dim enough to make everyone look important, and the menus don't list prices because the people who eat there aren't supposed to need to ask. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, the soft murmur of conversations that were never meant to be overheard. Robert Hargrove had chosen it. Of course he had. I had driven downtown alone that evening, parked 2 blocks away, and sat in my car for 4 minutes before going inside. Not because I was nervous. I have not been nervous in a restaurant in a very long time. I sat there because I wanted to be still for a moment before whatever came next. Because something in the way Robert's assistant had confirmed the reservation precise, formal, with a note that said, "Please arrive promptly." At 7 had told me this dinner was not about the wedding seating chart. I arrived at 7 exactly. Claire was already there. She was sitting beside Reed at the far side of the round table, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the blue dress she always wore when she wanted to feel composed. She looked up when she saw me, and something in her shoulders relaxed slightly, the way they always did when I walked into a room. 29 years, and that hadn't changed. I squeezed her hand when I sat down beside her. It was warm. She squeezed back. Reed sat to her left. He was in a dark jacket, his tie loosened just slightly at the collar the way young men do when they want to look relaxed but aren't. He gave me a polite smile and said, "Good evening." I said it back. Robert and Diane Hargrove were already seated across from us. Robert had the kind of presence that announced itself before he spoke. Broad shoulders, silver hair swept back from a face that had spent decades being taken seriously. His suit was charcoal and clearly expensive, not in a flashy way, but in the way that says money old enough to have stopped trying to prove itself. He stood briefly when I approached the table, a gesture of manners that managed to feel more like an assessment than a courtesy. Diane sat beside him in pale gold, her posture the careful kind that gets learned and then becomes permanent. She smiled at me with the particular warmth of a woman who has practiced warmth so long it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. Almost. "Pamela," she said. "My name, not Mrs. Voss." "Diane," I replied. Her name, not Mrs. Hargrove. We understood each other perfectly. For the first 20 minutes, the dinner was exactly what a dinner like that is supposed to be. Wine was poured, menus were opened and considered. Robert talked about a development project near the Gulch. Diane asked Claire about the hospital. Reed refilled my water glass without being asked, which I noticed, and Claire caught me noticing it and gave me a small, private smile. There were moments, sitting there in that warm light with my daughter beside me, when it almost felt like a normal evening. Almost. Then Robert set down his fork. He did it deliberately. The small sound of silverware against porcelain was quiet, but it landed in the conversation the way a gavel lands with the clear intention of calling something to order. He reached beside his chair and lifted a leather folder onto the table. Dark brown, brass clasp, the kind that closes with a soft, decisive click. He slid it across the white tablecloth toward Claire. "Before we finalize the wedding details," he said, his voice as smooth and unhurried as a man reading a memo he had already reviewed twice, "there's one matter we need to address." Claire looked at the folder, then at Reed. Reed was looking at the table. She opened it. I watched her face as she read. I have watched my daughter's face through 29 years of moments, her first day of kindergarten, the afternoon she told me she wanted to be a nurse, the night she called me from the hospital parking lot after a patient she'd cared for 6 weeks didn't make it. I knew every version of her expression. The one she wore now, as her eyes moved across the first page of that document, was one I had only seen a handful of times. It was the look of someone realizing that the floor beneath them is not as solid as they thought. Her hands had been resting flat on the edge of the folder. By the second page, they were trembling. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "A prenuptial agreement," Robert said. "Standard family protection. Lucas." She used Reed's given name, the way she only did when something mattered. "Did you know about this?" Reed didn't answer immediately. The 3 seconds that passed before he spoke told me more than his answer did. "It's something my family believes is important," he said. Diane leaned forward with a smile that was almost gentle. "It simply ensures that both families are protected, sweetheart. These things are standard at our level." Our level. 2 words that carried an entire architecture of assumption inside them. Claire turned more pages. I could see fragments of language from where I sat. Waiver of claims, asset separation, family trust provisions. She read slowly, carefully, the way people read things they are hoping they've misunderstood. When she reached the last page, she closed the folder and set her hands on top of it. Then Robert said the sentence that turned that dinner into something else entirely. "Sign it tonight," he said, "and the wedding proceeds as planned." He paused, in the way that people pause when they want the weight of what comes next to settle fully before it lands. "Or we cancel the ceremony now, before things become more complicated." The restaurant continued around us. Glasses clinked at the next table. Someone laughed softly near the bar. The world kept moving in its ordinary way, completely unaware that something had just shifted at ours. I placed my hand over Claire's. Her skin was cold. I looked at Robert Hargrove across that table at the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had just closed a negotiation, and I thought about something very specific. His family needed one signature to save their company. They just didn't know they were asking the wrong woman for it. But to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who was sitting at that table. I was not always someone who could sit across from a man like Robert Hargrove and feel nothing but clarity. That took a long time to learn. It took the kind of life that doesn't come with a roadmap, the kind you build year by year, decision by decision, out of materials that are never quite what you ordered. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 59 years old, and the woman I am today is almost entirely the work of a man who is no longer here to see it. I met Thomas Voss at a state teachers' conference in Knoxville in the fall of 1994. I was 28 years old, newly hired at a middle school in East Nashville, still convinced that the most important thing I would ever do was teach 7th grade English to children who mostly didn't want to be taught. Thomas was 31, a financial analyst at a small firm downtown, attending the conference because a client had asked him to present a session on saving for retirement to a room full of teachers who could barely afford their rent. He was terrible at presenting. He talked too fast, lost his place in his notes twice, and apologized for the projector slide that wouldn't advance, as if the technology had personally betrayed him. Afterward, I told him the content was good, but the delivery needed work. He looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just been given honest feedback they didn't ask for and found, to their surprise, that they were grateful for it. We had coffee that evening, then dinner, then, 4 months later, a very small wedding in a rented hall in Germantown with 40 people and a cake Claire's godmother baked herself. We didn't have money. We had something better, a shared conviction that if you paid close enough attention to how the world actually worked, not how people said it worked, but how it actually worked, you could build something real out of almost nothing. Thomas was the one who understood finance the way I understood language. Not the glamorous version of it, not the kind you read about in business magazines, the quiet version, the kind that lives in compound interest and patient decisions and the willingness to let time do work that impatience never could. He spent the first 10 years of our marriage working for other people's firms, learning things he would later use to build his own. I spent those same years teaching. Then, when Claire was 7 and our savings had grown enough to matter, I left the classroom and joined Thomas at the small investment firm he had started the year before. I was not an analyst. I was not a portfolio manager. I was the person who kept everything organized, who read every contract before it was signed, who asked the questions that everyone else assumed someone else had already asked. Thomas used to say I had the best eye for risk he had ever seen in anyone. I told him that was because I had spent a decade watching 12-year-olds try to get away with things. The skills were more transferable than people expected. Voss Capital Partners grew slowly, the way anything real grows. Not with a single dramatic moment, not with one lucky investment that changed everything overnight. It grew because Thomas was methodical, and I was careful, and we both understood that the most dangerous thing in finance is the belief that you are smarter than the market. We were never the loudest firm in Nashville. We were never the flashiest. We were the ones who were still standing when the loud and flashy ones weren't. Claire grew up watching us build it. She watched Thomas come home late and spread papers across the kitchen table and explained to her, when she was old enough to ask, why certain decisions got made and others didn't. She grew up understanding that money is a tool, not a destination, that what matters is not how much you have, but what you do with it, and whether you can explain your reasoning to someone you love at a kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I think that's why she became a nurse. She understood, the way her father and I understood, that the work that matters most is the work that shows up when people need it most. It wasn't glamorous, it was essential. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Thomas was diagnosed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, discovered late the way it almost always is. He was 57 years old and had just returned from a conference in Memphis where 3 separate people had told him he looked great. What followed was 8 months of treatments that slowed things down without stopping them, and a great deal of very honest conversation between 2 people who had spent 30 years learning to talk to each other without wasting words. In those 8 months, Thomas did 2 things I didn't fully understand at the time. The first was that he spent a considerable number of hours with our attorney, Marcus Webb, restructuring certain aspects of Voss Capital's ownership and governance in ways that Marcus explained to me in general terms, but that I did not examine closely, because Thomas was still alive and I did not yet need to understand them alone. The second was that he placed a sealed envelope in the small safe in our home office, wrote my name on the front in his careful handwriting, and told me not to open it until I needed to. "You'll know when," he said. "How will I know?" I asked. He looked at me the way he had looked at me across that conference room in Knoxville 30 years earlier, when I told him his presentation needed work, with the particular certainty of someone who has thought something through completely and trusts that the other person will catch up. "Everything I built," he said, "I built for you and Claire. You'll know what to do when the time comes." He died on a Thursday morning in April. The envelope stayed sealed for 6 years. I didn't fully understand what he meant until the night someone put a contract in front of my daughter. Life after Thomas did not stop moving. That was the thing nobody tells you, that grief does not pause the calendar. Seasons still changed. Claire still called on Sunday evenings. The maple tree in the backyard still dropped its leaves every October and grew them back every April, as if nothing had interrupted the arrangement. 6 years passed, and then one evening in October, 14 months before that dinner at Arden, Claire called me from her car in the Vanderbilt parking garage, her voice carrying the particular quality it gets when she is trying to sound casual about something she is not casual about at all. "I met someone," she said. "I was in the kitchen making tea. I set down the kettle. 'Tell me,' she told me. His name was Reed Hargrove. She had met him 3 weeks earlier at a charity fundraiser for affordable housing development, an event her hospital unit had sponsored, held at a venue downtown near the river. She had been staffing a table near the entrance, arranging pamphlets about the hospital's community outreach programs, when someone bumped the display from behind and sent a full glass of sparkling water directly across her carefully organized materials. The someone was Reed. "He didn't pretend it was an accident he couldn't have prevented," Claire said. "He just immediately started helping clean it up, got napkins from the bar, helped me resort everything, stayed until it was fixed." She paused. "Most people would have apologized and walked away." "And then?" I asked. "And then he helped me rebuild the whole display." We talked for the rest of the evening. I listened the way I had always listened to Claire, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the rhythm of what she chose to say and what she chose to leave out. She talked about Reed the way she talked about things she had thought through carefully before saying out loud, not gushing, not performing happiness, just describing something that had surprised her. "He's a Hargrove," she said, almost as an afterthought. I knew the name. Nashville is not as large a city as it presents itself to be, and in certain circles, the Hargrove name moved through conversations, the way weather moves through a valley you didn't always see it coming, but you felt it when it arrived. Robert Hargrove had built a real estate and logistics company that was well known in Tennessee business circles, prominent charity presence, the kind of family whose name appeared on building dedications and gala programs. "Does that matter to you?" I asked. "No," Claire said. "Should it?" "Not yet," I said. She laughed softly at that, the way she laughed when she knew I was being careful without being discouraging. We talked for another 20 minutes. By the time we hung up, I had a reasonable picture of a man I had never met, and the beginnings of a list of questions I intended to ask when I did. I met Reed Hargrove 6 weeks later. Claire brought him to the house on a Sunday afternoon in late November, the kind of cold, gray Nashville day when the light comes in low and flat through the kitchen windows and everything feels a little more serious than it does in summer. I had made coffee and set out a plate of the oatmeal cookies Claire had liked since she was 8 years old, which was either welcoming or a subtle power move, depending on how you looked at it. Reed arrived exactly on time. He was tall, early 30s, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested he had thought about the impression he was making without wanting to appear to have thought about it. Dark coat, good shoes, a slight tension around his jaw that he was doing his best to keep out of his expression. He was carrying flowers, not a lavish arrangement, but a modest bunch of cream-colored dahlias wrapped in brown paper from a florist on Gallatin Avenue. He handed them to me with both hands. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "these are for you." I thanked him and put them in water while Claire hung up his coat, watching him from the corner of my eye, the way I had watched students for 20 years, not looking for what they wanted me to see, but for the small, unguarded things they didn't know they were showing. We sat in the living room. Reed asked about the photographs on the bookshelf, which was either genuine curiosity or a practiced way of making people feel that their history mattered to him. I answered his questions and asked a few of my own. Where he had grown up, what drew him to his work, whether he liked Nashville or whether he had simply ended up here. He answered everything smoothly, comfortably, without hesitation. He was good at conversation, the kind of good that comes from having had it many times in rooms where it mattered. Claire brought out the coffee. Reed stood briefly when she set the tray down and thanked her in a way that was neither performative nor absent, just present. I noted that. We talked for nearly 2 hours. By the time he stood to leave, the afternoon light had gone from flat gray to the deeper blue of early evening. He shook my hand at the door, held it a half-second longer than strictly necessary, and looked at me with the kind of directness that people use when they want to be remembered. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "Claire talks about you constantly. I hope I get to know you better." I smiled. I said I hoped so too. After Claire walked him out, I stood in the kitchen doorway and turned the afternoon over in my mind the way I turned over balance sheets, looking not for what was there, but for what didn't quite add up. Reed Hargrove had said my name 3 times during that visit, each time without hesitation, each time with the easy familiarity of someone who had known it for longer than 2 hours. I had not introduced myself. Claire had not introduced me. He had simply known. Most people would have called it charm. I called it preparation. I have kept a notebook since I was 22 years old. It started as a teaching habit, a plain, small book where I recorded things worth remembering, student patterns, parent concerns, the particular dynamics of a classroom that shifted week by week and needed to be tracked if you wanted to understand them. Thomas used to tease me about it. "You notice everything," he said once. "It must be exhausting." I told him it was the opposite of exhausting. It was how I stayed calm. After I left teaching, the habit followed me into finance. The notebook changed color over the years, black, then brown, then a deep green, but the practice stayed the same. When something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. Date, detail, question. Not conclusions, just observations, held in sequence until a pattern emerged or didn't. The current notebook was navy blue. I had started it the January before Reed came into our lives. By December, 2 months after I first met him, it had 3 new entries. The first entry was dated a Sunday in early December, 11 months before the dinner at Arden. Reed and Claire had been seeing each other for about 6 weeks at that point. He had come to the house a second time, this occasion less formal than the first. Claire had invited him to join us for dinner, a simple thing, pasta and salad, and the kind of easy conversation that fills a table when everyone is making an effort to be comfortable. We were clearing the dishes when Reed asked about the house. Not casually, not the way people ask about a house when they're making conversation. He asked about the property specifically, whether the house had been in the family long, whether Thomas and I had always lived in East Nashville, or whether we'd moved there after building the firm. I answered simply, Thomas had bought the house in 1999. We had renovated it twice. Reed nodded. Then, with the smooth naturalness of a man who has learned to move through conversations without leaving visible footprints, he said, And the assets, are they mostly held through the firm, or did Thomas keep things structured separately? I looked at him. He was already reaching for another plate to carry to the kitchen, his expression unchanged, as if the question were as ordinary as asking about the weather. I said the firm handled most of it. He said that made sense. The conversation moved on. I went upstairs that evening and opened the Navy notebook. I wrote the date, and then I wrote, "Asked about asset structure, second visit, unprompted." The second entry came 3 weeks later. Claire had mentioned, over the phone, that she and Reed had been talking about Thomas. She said Reed had asked her questions about her father, what he had been like, how he had started the firm, what kind of work he had done before Voss Capital. She said she had enjoyed talking about it, that it was nice, she said, to be with someone who asked about her family instead of just talking about his own. I did not say what I was thinking. The following Sunday, Reed came for dinner again. At some point in the evening, he mentioned lightly, in the middle of a sentence about Nashville's development corridor, the name of the analytics firm where Thomas had worked before starting Voss Capital, a small company on Charlotte Avenue that had been absorbed into a larger firm in 2003 and no longer existed under its original name. I had not mentioned that firm to Reed. Claire had not mentioned it to me in years. The company's name was not on any public document connected to Voss Capital. It was the kind of detail you would only know if you had done specific research about Thomas Voss's professional history. I excused myself briefly after dinner and stepped into the hallway. I wrote the second entry. Knows Thomas's pre-Voss employment. Not public information. Source unknown. The third entry was the one that changed the quality of my attention entirely. It was a Tuesday evening in January, 10 months before the Arden dinner. Reed and Claire had stopped by after a movie unannounced, which Reed apologized for immediately, and which I told him was completely fine, because it was, and because unannounced visits are one of the better ways to see who someone actually is when they haven't had time to arrange themselves. We sat in the kitchen. I made hot chocolate. Claire and Reed sat close together on the same side of the table the way new couples do when proximity still feels like something worth choosing deliberately. We were talking about investment trends in Nashville's commercial real estate sector, a topic Reed had introduced, naturally, fluently, with the ease of a man who had done his reading. He made several observations that were sharp and well-informed. I agreed with most of them. And then, in the middle of a sentence about mid-market acquisition structures, he said it. It's interesting a firm like Voss Capital is actually well-positioned for exactly this kind of cycle. The kitchen was warm. Claire was laughing at something on her phone. The hot chocolate was steaming in our cups. I kept my expression exactly where it was. Voss Capital Partners was not a public firm. It did not advertise. It did not appear in business directories or Nashville Commerce publications. Its name had never come up in any conversation I had with Reed Hargrove. I was nearly certain Claire had never mentioned it by name, because Claire, who grew up in a household that valued discretion, understood without being told that the firm's business was not social conversation. Reed Hargrove had just said its name as if it were common knowledge. I waited until Claire had gone to the bathroom. Then I stood, walked to the counter where my notebook was sitting, and wrote the third entry in 3 short words. He knows more than he should. I closed the notebook and came back to the table. I didn't say anything to Claire. Not yet. Because I needed to know one more thing, whether Reed Hargrove was still acting or whether something had changed. Belle Meade sits on the western edge of Nashville, like a firm statement of intent. The neighborhood has been wealthy for long enough that it no longer needs to announce itself. The lots are large and set back from the street. The trees are old. The houses are the kind of substantial that comes not from size alone, but from the particular confidence of structures that were built without a budget ceiling and have been maintained accordingly ever since. Driving through it on a January evening, with the bare oaks lit from below by discreet landscape lighting and the smell of wood smoke in the cold air, you could almost believe that money had always looked exactly like this and always would. Reed had given me the address a week earlier, along with a brief and slightly formal message that said his parents were looking forward to the evening. Claire had been quieter than usual on the drive over, adjusting her earrings twice in the visor mirror and then putting them back the way they were the first time. "You're not nervous," she said to me. It was not quite a question. "I'm interested," I said. She looked at me sideways. "That's more concerning." I smiled and said nothing. The Hargrove house was set at the end of a long, paved driveway, flanked by boxwood hedges, trimmed to an exactness that suggested professional attention on a regular schedule. The house itself was Georgian-style brick, 3 stories, with tall windows that threw warm rectangles of light across the front lawn. A pair of gas lanterns flanked the entrance, burning with the steady, unhurried flame of things that are never turned off. Reed met us at the door. He looked relieved to see us, which told me something about what the hours before our arrival had been like. He kissed Claire on the cheek, shook my hand with both of his, and led us inside through a foyer where the floors were wide plank white oak and a round table at the center held an arrangement of white flowers tall enough to make a point. Robert Hargrove was waiting in the sitting room. He crossed toward us the moment we entered, with the unhurried authority of a man who moves through rooms on the understanding that rooms will adjust to him. He was larger than I had expected from photographs, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that takes up space not aggressively but as a matter of settled fact. His grip when he shook my hand was firm and held a half-second too long, the particular kind of handshake that is not about greeting but about establishing something. I matched his grip and held it the same half-second. His eyes registered that. He smiled. Diane appeared from the hallway a moment later, moving with the smooth, considered grace of a woman who has spent decades in rooms where being watched was simply the condition of being present. She wore deep burgundy and pearl earrings, and her smile arrived on cue, warm, perfectly calibrated, the kind of smile that gives nothing away because it was designed to give nothing away. "Eleanor," she said, "we've heard so much about you." "And I about you," I said. We moved to the dining room, where a table set for 5 waited under a chandelier that suggested the room was used to occasions larger than tonight: crystal, silver, white linen, the kind of table that communicates, before anyone sits down, that this is a family that takes the presentation of itself seriously. The first half of dinner moved the way these evenings always move, carefully, like chess pieces being positioned before anyone commits to an attack. We talked about Nashville's growth, about Reed's work, about the hospital where Claire had recently taken on additional responsibilities. Robert spoke in the measured tones of a man accustomed to leading conversations, and Diane asked questions with the precision of someone who had learned that the right question, asked pleasantly, could yield more information than any direct demand. She asked where I had studied. "University of Tennessee," I said. "English literature." She nodded with the particular smile that people use when an answer has confirmed something they already suspected. Robert asked what my firm did. "Investment management," I said. "Private holdings, mostly." He asked if it was a large operation. "Small but focused," I said. "We prefer depth to breadth." He nodded as if this were the expected answer from a firm of limited significance and moved the conversation to a development project his company had recently completed near the airport. He described it with the proprietary satisfaction of a man describing something he believed placed him in a category others could only observe from a distance. I listened. I asked 2 questions, both of them simple, both of them designed to sound like polite interest rather than what they actually were. An assessment of how much he understood about the financial mechanics of his own projects. The answers told me he understood the surface of things very well. Dessert arrived. Reed and Claire were talking quietly at the other end of the table. Robert set down his fork and looked at me with the comfortable directness of a man who had decided the pleasantries portion of the evening was complete. "You know," he said, "we're a family that has always done things a certain way. Built from nothing, really. My father started with 1 property in Murfreesboro and worked his way up over 40 years. Everything the Hargrove family has, we built from the ground up." He paused in the way people pause when they want what they've just said to be received as a value statement rather than a boast. "We're very protective of that legacy." I set my own fork down. I looked at him across the white linen and the crystal and the remains of a dinner that had been designed in every detail to establish who he was and where I stood in relation to it. "I understand completely," I said. And I thought, so have I. The Hargroves believed they were interviewing me that evening. What they didn't realize was that I had been studying them for months. There is a particular kind of courage that arrives too late and knows it. I have seen it in classrooms: the student who raises their hand after the moment for answering has already passed, who speaks into a silence that has already made its own statement. I have seen it in boardrooms, In the careful way people begin sentences they should have begun 2 meetings earlier. It has a texture to it, that kind of courage, something between honesty and apology, neither one fully formed. Reed Hargrove called me on a Wednesday morning in March, 7 months before the dinner at Arden. He asked if he could come by. Just him. He said there was something he wanted to talk about and that he thought it should be in person. His voice had the measured quality of someone who had rehearsed the request carefully enough that it no longer sounded rehearsed, which itself takes a certain amount of practice. I said he could come that afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock, which was exactly when he said he would. He was in a gray sweater and dark trousers, no jacket, which made him look younger than he usually did and more uncertain than he probably intended. He was carrying nothing, no flowers this time, no folder, no prop of any kind. Just himself, standing at my door with his hands in his pockets and the particular expression of a man who has decided to say something difficult and has not yet fully committed to the version of it he will use. I brought him into the kitchen. I put water on for coffee. He sat at the table, the same chair Claire always took, nearest the window, and looked out at the backyard for a moment before turning toward me. "I appreciate you seeing me," he said. "Of course," I said. I set out 2 mugs and waited. Reed was good at conversation in social settings, fluid, confident, quick to find the register that made other people comfortable. But here, in my kitchen, on a Wednesday afternoon with no audience and no agenda but the one he had come to set, he was different. He started twice before the coffee was ready and stopped himself both times, not because he was searching for words, but because the words he kept reaching for weren't quite the right ones, and he knew it. I poured the coffee and sat down across from him and said nothing. The 3rd time he started, he got further. "Claire is." He paused, looked down at his mug. "She's not like anyone I've spent time with before. I mean that genuinely." He looked up. "She's honest in a way that most people aren't. She doesn't perform. She just..." He stopped again. "She just is," I said. "Yes." He seemed relieved that I had said it, and then immediately aware that being relieved was perhaps not the impression he wanted to give. "I know you've had questions about me. I know you've been..." Another pause. The 3rd one, longer than the first 2. Whatever he had been about to say folded back into itself, and he reached instead for something safer. "I want you to know my intentions are serious." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. The coffee was steaming between us. I looked at him steadily. I had spent 30 years in rooms where what people said and what they meant were 2 separate conversations, running simultaneously, and I had learned early that the most important thing you could do in those rooms was resist the instinct to fill silence on someone else's behalf. Silence has its own pressure. Given enough of it, most people will say the truest thing they know. So I let the silence stay. And then I said, "I know they are now." Reed held my gaze. "The question," I continued, keeping my voice level and my expression neutral, "is whether they always were." It was not an accusation. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I said it the way you state a fact that has been sitting in the room for a while and simply hasn't been named yet. Reed Hargrove did not answer. He did not say, "Of course they were," or "What do you mean by that?" or "I don't understand the question." He did not laugh it off or redirect or deploy the easy social fluency I had watched him use in every other conversation we had ever had. He simply sat across from me in my kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon and was very still. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The dog down the block had stopped barking. The refrigerator hummed its low, continuous note. 4, 5, 6. Reed's hands were wrapped around his coffee mug. His knuckles were not white. He wasn't gripping it tightly, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that had gone very carefully neutral, the way a person goes neutral when they are managing something from the inside. 7, 8. Then he said, "I care about Claire. Not my intentions have always been serious. Not, I don't know what you're implying. Just that. A statement about the present tense, offered into a question about the past." I nodded once. "I know you do." We finished our coffee. We talked about other things, Claire's upcoming schedule at the hospital, a new restaurant that had opened on Germantown's main stretch, the unseasonably warm weather Nashville had been having for March. Reed was composed, pleasant, careful. He stayed for 40 minutes and left as punctually as he had arrived. I walked him to the door. He thanked me for the coffee. I said any time. After the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, opened the Navy notebook to a fresh page, and wrote one line. He knows exactly what I was asking, and he chose not to answer it. 8 seconds of silence can tell you more than 8 months of conversation. The 6 months between Reed's visit to my kitchen and the phone call from Marcus Webb were, on the surface, the quietest of the entire year. Claire and Reed got engaged in September, on a Thursday evening at a restaurant near the river where they had gone on one of their first dates. Reed called me the following morning before Claire did, which I noticed to say he had asked her and she had said yes and that he hoped I was pleased. I told him I was glad Claire was happy. That was true. It was also, carefully, not the same thing as the answer he was looking for. The engagement moved quickly into the machinery of planning. Venue deposits and guest lists and the particular exhaustion of decisions that feel significant until you've made 300 of them and they all start to feel the same. Claire handled it with the focused practicality she brought to everything, the same way she managed a difficult shift at the hospital by identifying what needed to happen and moving through the list without drama. The Hargroves, for their part, offered opinions frequently and resources generously, both of which came with the quiet implication that the two were connected. Diane had preferences about the venue. Robert had preferences about the guest count. Reed navigated between his parents and Claire with the careful diplomacy of someone walking a path he had walked before, and I watched all of it from a comfortable distance, saying little, writing nothing new in the Navy notebook, waiting for the thing I had been waiting for since January, without knowing exactly what shape it would take when it arrived. It arrived on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks before the wedding. I was in the home office, reviewing a quarterly report, when my phone rang. The display said Marcus Webb. Marcus did not call in the evenings without reason. I answered on the second ring. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm sorry to call this late. Something came up today that I thought you should know about before it went any further." Marcus had been my attorney for nearly 15 years. He had the deliberate, economical speech of a man who understood that words, like capital, should not be spent carelessly. When he said something came up, it meant something specific had occurred and he had already considered it carefully before picking up the phone. "Go ahead," I said. "I received a formal inquiry this afternoon," he said. "A financial consulting firm out of Atlanta Meridian Advisory Group. They were requesting information about the governance structure of Voss Capital Partners. Specifically, they wanted to know about majority ownership provisions and whether any transfer mechanisms existed that could be activated through a spousal or marital arrangement." I set down the quarterly report. "Did you recognize the firm?" I asked. "I did after I looked into it," Marcus said. "Meridian Advisory has done work for Hargrove Group on at least 2 previous occasions. The inquiry came through a third party, but the paper trail isn't particularly well obscured." I said I understood. I asked him to document everything and send me what he had. He said he would have it to me by morning. We hung up. I sat at the desk for several minutes without moving. Outside, the October night had settled into the particular stillness that comes after 9 o'clock in East Nashville. The traffic thinned, the neighborhood quiet, the kind of silence that feels inhabited rather than empty. The lamp on the desk was the only light in the room. Everything else was dark. I thought about the 3 entries in the Navy notebook. I thought about Reed in my kitchen in March, choosing the present tense when I asked about the past. I thought about Robert Hargrove at his dining room table in Belle Meade, talking about legacy with the certainty of a man who believed the word belonged to him. And I thought about Thomas. I got up from the desk and walked to the closet at the far end of the office. Behind the filing cabinet, set into the wall, was the small safe that had been there since we bought the house. Gray steel, combination lock, the same combination Thomas had chosen, and I had never changed. I opened it. Inside, the documents I had placed there over the years. Insurance policies, property records, the folder from Marcus Webb that contained the restructured ownership papers for Voss Capital. And at the back, standing upright against the left side of the safe, the envelope, white, letter-sized, sealed with the careful thoroughness of someone who intended it to stay sealed for a long time. Thomas's handwriting on the front, the particular backward slant of it that I had spent 30 years learning to read at a glance, on grocery lists and margin notes and birthday cards that said more in 3 lines than most people said in paragraphs. For Eleanor. Open when Claire needs you most. I had looked at that envelope dozens of times in 6 years. I had opened the safe for other documents and seen it there, and closed the safe again without touching it, because the moment had not yet been the right moment, and I had trusted myself to know the difference. I took it out now. It was lighter than it looked. 1 sheet of paper inside, maybe 2. I turned it over in my hands. The seal was intact, a strip of paper tape pressed flat along the entire length of the flap, the edges burnished down with something firm, a thumbnail or a bone folder. Thomas had sealed it the way he did everything that mattered, completely, without leaving a gap. I set it on the desk in front of me. I sat down. I picked it up again. The lamp threw a small circle of light across the desk and the envelope in my hands. The rest of the room was dark and quiet. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly on the street, and its headlights moved across the wall and disappeared. I held the envelope for a long time. Thomas had been gone for 6 years, but sitting there in the dark with that envelope in my hands, it felt like he was still watching. I have always believed that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that feel like facts. People make them constantly in business, in relationships, in the quiet stories they tell themselves about why things are the way they are. They take a pattern they recognize, layer it over a situation they don't fully understand, and proceed as if the map and the territory are the same thing. It works, most of the time, until it doesn't. 3 days after Marcus's call, on a Friday morning in October, I sat down at my desk with a second cup of coffee and a request I had sent Marcus the evening before, a full financial profile on Hargrove Group. Not the public version, the kind that appears in press releases and business journal features and charity gala programs, the real version. Debt structures, acquisition timelines, refinancing arrangements, partnership agreements, the kind of document that takes a skilled attorney with the right connections approximately 48 hours to assemble. Marcus had delivered it at 7 in the morning with a short message. Read Section 3 first. I read Section 3 first. Hargrove Group had spent the past 4 years in a pattern of aggressive expansion that was not unusual for a company of its size and ambition, but that had left it carrying a debt load that required everything to keep moving in order to remain manageable. Real estate development projects leveraged against projected returns, logistics contracts secured against future revenue, the kind of financial architecture that functions perfectly as long as no single piece of it stops moving. 2 of those pieces had slowed considerably in the past 18 months. A mixed-use development near Brentwood had run 18 months behind schedule due to permitting complications, absorbing capital that had been projected to cycle back into other projects by now. A logistics partnership in Memphis had underperformed by 31% against projections, creating a gap in cash flow that had been covered, for the moment, by a short-term credit facility that was set to mature in 11 weeks. 11 weeks. Roughly 90 days from the date of the most recent filing. And there, in the middle of Section 3, in the careful language of corporate financial disclosure, was the detail that changed the shape of everything I had been looking at for the past 10 months. Hargrove Group was in advanced negotiations for a strategic acquisition, a transaction valued at approximately $200 million that, if completed, would consolidate their logistics operations, retire the short-term debt, and position the company for the next decade of growth. The acquiring entity was referred to in the document by its legal designation only, a holding structure name I recognized immediately. I set down my coffee. I read the paragraph again. Then I opened a separate file on my laptop, the internal portfolio summary for Voss Capital Partners, the document I reviewed at the beginning of every quarter to confirm the status of our holdings, and I scrolled to the section on strategic investments. The holding structure name was there, listed as a Voss Capital portfolio asset, acquired 6 years earlier, shortly after Thomas's diagnosis, during the same 8-month period when he and Marcus had been quietly restructuring the firm's governance. An investment I had reviewed in general terms many times since then, but had never had reason to examine against the specific financial needs of another company. I closed both files. I stood up from the desk and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard for a while. The October light was flat and gray, the maple tree mostly bare now, a few last leaves holding on with the stubborn patience of things that haven't yet accepted the season has changed. I thought about Robert Hargrove at his dining room table in Belmead, describing his family's legacy with the absolute confidence of a man who believed the future was already arranged in his favor. I thought about the inquiry Marcus had received from Meridian Advisory, the request for information about Voss Capital's ownership structure, specifically about whether any transfer mechanism could be activated through a marital arrangement. I thought about Reed in my kitchen in March. I want you to know my intentions are serious, present tense, carefully chosen. I thought about a charity fundraiser in October of the previous year, where a young man had spilled sparkling water on a display table and stayed to help clean it up, and where Claire had spent the rest of the evening talking to him and come home with the particular brightness in her voice that I had not heard in years. And I thought about timing. The acquisition needed to close within 90 days. The wedding was in 2 weeks. The prenuptial agreement, if Claire signed it, would, according to the inquiry Marcus had received, contain mechanisms designed to make Voss Capital's holdings accessible through the marital estate. It was not a complicated picture, once you had all the pieces. Robert Hargrove had not engineered his son's relationship with my daughter because he disliked her, or because he thought she was unworthy of the Hargrove name, or because he was simply the kind of man who controlled everything in his orbit out of habit. He had done it or allowed it to be done because somewhere in his financial planning, someone had identified Voss Capital Partners as the key to a transaction worth $200 million and had then identified the most direct route to accessing it. That route ran directly through Claire. I went back to the desk and sat down. The laptop screen was still open, both files minimized in the taskbar. The coffee had gone cold. I sat there for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, doing the kind of thinking that doesn't require a screen or a notebook or any external surface at all, the kind that happens entirely in the space between what you know and what it means. When I finally moved, I reached for the navy notebook. I opened it to the next clean page, and I wrote one line. Now I know why. Robert Hargrove didn't need a daughter-in-law. He needed a signature, and he had spent months engineering the perfect way to get it without ever knowing who he was really dealing with. I waited until Wednesday evening, not because I needed more time to decide. I had decided the moment I closed the laptop on Friday and written those 3 words in the navy notebook. But there is a difference between being ready to do something and being ready for what it will cost you. I spent the weekend in that space between the two, going through the ordinary motions of the days, groceries, a phone call with Claire about the rehearsal dinner schedule, a long walk through the neighborhood on Sunday morning when the air was cold enough to see my breath and the sidewalks were empty and I could think without interruption. By Wednesday, I was ready for both. I waited until the house was completely quiet, no traffic on the street, no neighbors' lights visible through the window, nothing but the deep stillness of a Wednesday night settling into itself. I made tea and carried it to the office. I turned on only the desk lamp, the same one that had been burning on Tuesday when Marcus called, and I sat down in the chair where I had sat for 30 years of decisions that mattered. I took the envelope out of the safe. I set it on the desk in front of me and looked at Thomas's handwriting one more time, the backward slant of it, the particular way he formed the capital E in my name, with the 3 horizontal lines perfectly even, as if he had been taught by someone who believed letters should be built with the same care as anything else worth building. Then I opened it. The seal came apart cleanly, the paper tape, releasing in one long strip the way it does when something has been applied with patience and allowed to set completely. Inside were 3 pages, folded in thirds, covered on both sides in the same backward slanting hand. The paper was the cream-colored legal stationery Thomas had kept in the top drawer of this same desk. I could see the faint impression of the pen on the back of the first page where he had pressed harder than usual, the way people do when they are writing something they need to get exactly right. I smoothed the pages flat and began to read. He had dated it in April, 2 months before he died. He had written it, he said in the first paragraph, because there were things he wanted me to know that he had found increasingly difficult to say out loud, not because he didn't have the words, but because every time he tried to say them in person, he watched my face and lost his nerve. "You're too good at staying steady," he wrote. "It makes me want to be steady too. But some things need to be said in writing, where I can finish the sentence." He talked about the firm, about the decisions he and Marcus had made in the months after the diagnosis, while he still had the clarity to make them. He had restructured things deliberately, not to hide anything, but to protect it, to build a structure that couldn't be dismantled by accident or carelessness or by someone who didn't understand what they were touching. He had thought carefully about what would happen to Voss Capital when he was no longer there to run it, and he had arranged things so that the answer was nothing without Eleanor. And then he wrote the paragraph that stopped my breath. I don't know who will come. I don't know what shape it will take, but I know that what we built is worth wanting, and people who want things badly enough find ways to go after them. There will come a moment when someone tries to use Claire to get to what we built. You'll know it when you see it. Don't be afraid to use everything we have. I set the pages down. I sat with those words for a long time. Thomas had been a methodical man, careful, precise, not given to dramatic predictions or worst-case thinking for its own sake. If he had written those words, it was not because he was afraid. It was because he had done the math, the way he always did, and the math had told him something worth preparing for. I picked up the pages and read on. The second page was more practical. It described, in careful detail, the specific legal mechanism Marcus had built into the Voss Capital governance structure during those 8 months, a provision that Thomas had included as a precaution and that I had acknowledged in my signatures without examining closely, because at the time my attention had been elsewhere, as Thomas had perhaps known it would be. The provision existed. Thomas had made sure of that. And in the third page, in the same careful handwriting, he had written exactly how to use it, step by step, the way he used to write instructions for things around the house that he was afraid might need fixing after he was gone. At the bottom of the third page, below the last line of instructions, he had written 4 words that were not instructions at all. I believed in you. I don't know exactly when I started crying. Somewhere between the second page and the third, in the space between the practical and the personal, the steadiness I had been maintaining for the better part of a week simply ran out. Not dramatically, not the way grief comes when it is fresh and has nowhere to go. This was quieter than that, just the slow, complete release of something that had been held in place for a long time by the sheer necessity of holding it. The last time I had cried for Thomas was at his funeral, 6 years ago, standing at the graveside while Claire held my hand and the April wind moved through the cemetery trees and the minister said words that were true but not sufficient, the way words at funerals always are. I had not cried for him since. There had been no room for it. There had been too much to do. I sat in the desk chair for a long time after the crying stopped, the 3 pages spread across the desk in the circle of lamplight, Thomas's handwriting everywhere. Then I folded them carefully back along their original creases, placed them in the envelope, and set it beside the navy notebook. My husband had written me a roadmap for a moment he prayed would never come. It had come. And now I knew exactly which direction to walk. I called Marcus at 7:15 in the morning. He answered before the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. Marcus Webb had been an attorney for 31 years, and he had developed the particular sixth sense of someone who spends their professional life in the space between what documents say and what they mean. He knew, from the tone of a 7:15 phone call, that something had shifted. I opened the envelope last night, I said. A brief pause. And I need you to look at something with me. The Hargrove prenuptial agreement, the full document. I can be at your office in an hour, he said. He arrived at 8:20 with a copy of the prenuptial agreement in a manila folder and 2 coffees from the place on Gallatin Avenue, which I noted and appreciated. He set everything on the desk without ceremony and sat down across from me the way he always did, straight-backed, reading glasses already on, ready to work. I had printed the agreement the previous week after the dinner at Arden, when Claire had brought it home in the leather folder and left it on the kitchen counter without a word, the way you leave something you can't look at anymore, but can't bring yourself to throw away. I had read through it twice that night and found the standard architecture of these things: asset separation, property waivers, the usual provisions that are unremarkable in isolation and collectively amount to a great deal. I had not, on those first 2 readings, reached page 11 with the full attention it deserved. Marcus opened the folder and turned directly to the back section. He had flagged several pages with small adhesive tabs, yellow, precisely placed, the kind of preparation that meant he had already read it carefully and knew exactly where he was going. "Walk me through it," I said. He turned to the second to last page. "The agreement is structured in the standard way through Section 13, he said. Asset separation, non-commingling provisions, property waivers. Nothing unusual. A slightly aggressive valuation methodology for the Hargrove family holdings, but nothing that would raise an immediate flag on its own. He turned one more page. Section 14 is where it changes. The page was dense with the compressed, subordinate clause-heavy language that legal documents use when they want something to be technically visible but practically invisible present for the purposes of disclosure, but buried deep enough that most people, signing in a lawyer's office 2 weeks before their wedding, would not pause long enough to parse it fully. Subsection 14. A. Addressed intellectual property associated with either party's professional work during the marriage. Standard enough. Subsection 14. B was 9 lines long. I read it while Marcus watched me. In the event that the signing party is the beneficiary of an estate established by a deceased spouse prior to the marriage, any financial instruments, ownership stakes, or investment vehicles held within that estate shall, upon the execution of this agreement, be reclassified as marital assets subject to the terms of the Hargrove Family Trust governance structure. Said reclassification shall take effect automatically at the 12-month anniversary of the marriage date, without requirement of additional consent or documentation from either party. I read it again. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, Claire's father died before this marriage. His estate, including any ownership interests he held or transferred, would qualify as a deceased spouse's estate under this language. I kept my eyes on the page, and the reclassification would trigger automatically at the 12-month mark, Marcus said. No additional action required from Claire, no court process. The governance structure of the Hargrove Family Trust would simply absorb whatever was in scope. I looked up. What would be in scope? Marcus took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. It was a small gesture, but I had known him long enough to understand that he removed his glasses when he wanted to say something without the professional distance the glasses provided. Anything Thomas left her, he said. Anything that traces back to his estate. The office was quiet. Outside, the Thursday morning had fully arrived, the sound of a delivery truck on the street, a neighbor's car backing out of a driveway, the ordinary percussion of a day beginning. None of it seemed to have any connection to what was sitting on the desk between us. I picked up the document and read subsection 14b a third time. The language was precise. It had been written by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, someone who knew that the broadest possible definition of deceased spouse's estate, combined with an automatic 12-month trigger and a waiver of additional consent requirements, would accomplish, without any dramatic confrontation or obvious coercion, what a direct request never could. It would transfer Thomas's legacy to the Hargrove family while Claire was still arranging thank you notes from the wedding. I set the document down. I did not slam it. I did not make any particular sound. I simply placed it flat on the desk and rested my hands on top of it and sat with the full weight of what I was looking at for the span of several quiet seconds. Then I folded it closed. Marcus waited. Say it plainly, I said. He looked at me steadily. This isn't a prenup, Eleanor. This is a transfer of ownership document disguised as one. I nodded once. I stood and walked to the window. The maple tree in the backyard had lost its last leaves since Wednesday. The branches were bare now, clean lines against the gray October sky, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. I thought about the dinner at Arden, the white tablecloths and the dim lighting, and Robert Hargrove's smooth, unhurried voice saying, "Sign it tonight and the wedding proceeds as planned." The way he had looked at me across the table with the complete confidence of a man who believed he was holding all the significant cards. I thought about Claire's hands on that leather folder, the color leaving her face as she read. I thought about Thomas's letter on my desk. Don't be afraid to use everything we have. They hadn't come for Claire. They had come for Thomas's legacy, and they had dressed it up in wedding flowers and champagne to make sure nobody noticed. After Marcus left, the house felt very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an ordinary Thursday afternoon, but the particular quiet that follows a conversation that has changed the shape of the room it happened in. I stood at the kitchen window for a while after I heard his car pull out of the driveway, looking at the bare maple tree and the flat October sky and thinking about 12-month anniversary clauses and the specific kind of patience required to engineer something this deliberate. Then I picked up my phone and called Sandra Cho. Sandra had been my closest friend for 22 years, since we taught at the same middle school in East Nashville, and discovered, over a shared lunch in the faculty room one November, that we had independently arrived at the same theory about why a particular student's behavior had shifted dramatically in October. We had been comparing notes ever since. She answered on the third ring. "Are you home this afternoon?" I asked. A brief pause. Sandra had known me long enough to read the specific weight of that particular question. "I can be there in 40 minutes, she said. She arrived in 35, which was Sandra's way of communicating that she had taken the question seriously. She was carrying a paper bag from Frothy Monkey and 2 drinks in a cardboard carrier, and she was wearing her weekend clothes, dark jeans, a gray pullover, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, which meant she had been home and come directly without stopping to change. She set everything on the kitchen table, looked at my face, and said, "Tell me." So I told her. I started at the beginning, not the dinner at Arden, but further back, the way you have to start when something has been accumulating for a long time, and the ending only makes sense if you understand the sequence. I told her about the 3 notebook entries, about the financial inquiry Marcus had received, about the envelope and Thomas's letter and what it said, about Section 14 of the prenuptial agreement and the 9 lines of subsection 14b that had been sitting inside a leather folder on my kitchen counter for over a week. Sandra listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her expression moving through what I was saying like weather moving through an open landscape. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That absolute. Sandra." She exhaled. "Sorry." She set down her coffee. Okay. She pressed her fingers to her lips briefly, the gesture she used when she was managing something from the inside. "So the prenup isn't a prenup. It's a transfer mechanism. And they've been building toward this for over a year." "At least," I said. "Possibly longer." Sandra looked at the table between us. "Does Claire know any of this?" "Reed?" I considered that for a moment. I'm not certain what Reed knows and what he was told. Those aren't the same thing. Sandra nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee again, took a sip, and looked at me over the rim. "When are you going to tell her?" "Not yet." She set the cup down carefully. "Eleanor, I need more than what I have," I said. "What I have right now is a document with a problematic clause and a financial inquiry that points in a direction I can't yet prove in a room with Claire present. If I tell her today, she'll confront Reed, Reed will go to his father, and whatever evidence still exists in a form I can actually use will disappear before Marcus can touch it." Sandra absorbed that. She had been a teacher long enough to understand the particular discipline of waiting until you were certain before you acted, and the particular damage of acting before you were. "All right," she said. "What do you need? Right now?" "Just this." I gestured between us. "Someone to think with." She nodded. "Then think." We sat with it for a while, the way we used to sit with difficult problems in the faculty room, not forcing it, just turning it over together in the shared space of the table and the afternoon light and the familiar comfort of someone who had been thinking alongside you for 22 years. Then Sandra said, "There's something I should probably tell you." I looked at her. "About 2 months ago," she said, "I was at Frothy Monkey, the one on 12th Avenue South. I was there in the afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock. It was a Wednesday." She paused. "Reed was there." "I know where Frothy Monkey is," I said. "Go on." "He wasn't alone. He was at a table near the back, not the main area, the section around the corner where it's a little more private. He was with a man I didn't recognize." She reached for her coffee and then didn't drink it. "Older. Late 50s, maybe 60. Well-dressed, not in a flashy way, but the kind of dress that means it's a habit rather than an effort. He had a laptop open and what looked like a stack of documents, physical papers, not just a notebook. They were both leaning forward over the table. "Did Reed see you?" "No." "I was at the counter. I thought about going over, but something about the way they were sitting stopped me. It looked like a meeting, not a conversation. She met my eyes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was a work thing. But after what you just told me, you're thinking about it differently now." I turned the information over carefully. 2 months ago, a Wednesday afternoon, a man in his late 50s or early 60s with a laptop and physical documents, meeting Reed in the corner section of a coffee shop on 12th Avenue South, in a posture that read like a working meeting rather than a social one. I didn't say what I was thinking. Not yet. Don't mention this to anyone, I said. Sandra looked at me. Obviously. And don't say anything to Claire. Not until I have what I need. She nodded once, firmly. When will that be? I looked at the bare maple tree through the kitchen window. Before the wedding, I said. Sandra held my gaze. Then we'd better move. The truth has a way of finding its own path. Our job was simply to make sure it arrived before the wedding did. The Friday after Sandra's visit was the kind of day that moves slowly without knowing why. I had tasks to attend to a quarterly review that Marcus had sent over, 2 phone calls related to Voss Capital's ongoing portfolio management, the ordinary administrative weight of a business that continues regardless of what is happening in your personal life. I worked through the morning and into the afternoon with the focused discipline I had learned in the years after Thomas died, when keeping moving was not optional and the work was the structure that held everything else in place. Claire called at noon, briefly, to ask about the rehearsal dinner seating arrangement. She sounded tired but steady the way she sounded during a difficult stretch at the hospital, when the work was hard but manageable and she was handling it without complaint. We talked for 12 minutes. She did not mention Reed. I did not mention anything I had learned in the past 72 hours. After I hung up, I sat at the desk for a moment and thought about how much a person can carry without showing it, and whether that was always a virtue. Sandra texted at 2 o'clock. Anything? I replied, not yet. She sent back a single period, which was her way of saying she understood and would not ask again until I had something to tell her. The afternoon passed. The light outside the office window moved from the flat gray of midday to the deeper, more deliberate quality of late afternoon in October, when the sun sits low and everything it touches looks slightly more significant than it did an hour before. I was in the kitchen making dinner when my phone rang at 6:47. The screen said, Reed Hargrove. I turned off the burner and answered. Mrs. Voss. His voice was different from the last time we had spoken, different from the controlled, socially fluent Reed I had watched navigate every room he had ever entered with the ease of someone who had been practicing since childhood. This was something underneath that, something that had been there in my kitchen in March for 8 seconds and had been carefully managed ever since. Reed, I said. I'm sorry to call in the evening. He paused. I was wondering if we could meet, just the 2 of us, tomorrow morning, if that works. I kept my voice even. Can you tell me what this is about? Another pause, shorter than the first but more concentrated. There's something I need to say to you in person. I've been trying to figure out the right time, and I don't think there is a right time anymore. There's just... He stopped. I think I've run out of time. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The maple tree was bare and still in the evening dark, the branches visible against the sky as clean, unambiguous lines. All right, I said. Before I say yes, I want to ask you something. Okay. I let a moment pass. Not dramatically, just long enough for what I was about to say to arrive with the weight it deserved. Reed, I said, does Claire know everything about how you 2 met? The silence that followed was different from the 8 seconds in March. That silence had been the silence of management, of someone deciding in real time how much to reveal and arriving at a carefully chosen minimum. This one was different. This was the silence of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had just felt the full weight of it land. I counted. 1, 2. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street. 3, 4, 5. I did not fill the silence. I had learned, over many years and many rooms, that the most important thing you could do when a silence like this opened up was simply to let it be what it was. 6, 7. Somewhere in the house, the furnace clicked on the first time since spring, the season finally conceding to itself. 8, 9. I need to explain something in person, Reed said. His voice had changed again. The social fluency was completely gone now. What remained was something simpler and more difficult, the voice of a person who has decided, after a long time of deciding otherwise, to stop performing and say the true thing. Tomorrow morning, I said. 9 o'clock. Thank you, he said. And then, after a very brief pause, Mrs. Voss, I need you to know that what I feel for Claire is real. Whatever else you're about to find out, that part is real. I listened to that sentence the way I listened to everything, not just to what it said, but to where it placed itself in the sequence of things. He had said whatever else you're about to find out, not whatever you think, not whatever you've heard. Whatever else you're about to find out, which meant he already understood that I knew something, and that what he was coming to tell me tomorrow would be an addition to it, not a correction. "I'll see you at 9, I said. We hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. The burner was off. The pot was sitting where I had left it, a half-made dinner that no longer seemed particularly relevant. I pulled out the chair at the kitchen table, Claire's chair, the one nearest the window, and sat down. The kitchen was quiet and warm. The light above the table was the only one on in the house. Through the window, the October dark had settled fully into the neighborhood, the street outside visible only as the occasional sweep of passing headlights across the ceiling. I sat there for a long time. I was not afraid of what Reed was going to tell me tomorrow. I already knew the shape of it. What I sat with, in that quiet kitchen, was something more complicated than fear, the particular weight of being the person who holds information that will change someone you love, and knowing that the changing is necessary, and knowing that necessary and painless are almost never the same thing. I thought about Claire, about the blue dress she wore when she wanted to feel composed, about her hands on the leather folder at Arden, the color leaving her face page by page. She deserved the truth. She had always deserved it. I just needed a few more hours to make sure it arrived with everything it needed to stand on. I placed my phone face down on the table. 9 seconds of silence. That was all I needed to know, that what he was about to tell me would change everything, and that he already knew it. He was early. I heard the car in the driveway at 8:52, 8 minutes before 9, and I understood from that alone that whatever Reed Hargrove had been doing since we hung up last night, he had not been sleeping. People who have slept arrive on time. People who have been awake since 3 in the morning arrive early because waiting has become unbearable, and movement is the only thing that feels like progress. I opened the door before he knocked. He was in jeans and a plain dark jacket, no tie, no careful grooming. His hair was slightly uneven, the way hair gets when someone has run their hands through it too many times. He looked younger than 32 and considerably older at the same time, the specific combination that exhaustion and guilt produce when they've been working together for a while. "Come in," I said. I brought him to the kitchen, not the living room, not the formal spaces of the house, the kitchen, where the table was ordinary and the light was practical, and there was nowhere to hide behind the architecture of a room designed for appearances. I put coffee on. He sat in the chair nearest the window, which was Claire's chair, and I noted that he chose it without thinking, the way people reach for the things that feel like the person they're trying to hold on to. He wrapped both hands around the mug I set in front of him and looked at the table for a long moment before he started. "My father found the name Voss in a partnership filing," he said. "About 16 months ago. He was reviewing a structure connected to an acquisition target, and the name came up in a layered holding arrangement. He didn't know what it meant at first. He had someone look into it. I said nothing. I sat across from him and let him talk. They couldn't get much," Reed continued. "Voss Capital runs quiet, there's almost nothing public. But they got enough to know it was privately held, that the principal was a woman in Nashville, and that the governance structure was connected to a transaction they needed to close." He looked up briefly and then back down. "My father brought it to me. He said there was a woman, a widow with a daughter. He said the daughter was in a position where a relationship might create an opening. The coffee was steaming between us. Outside, the Saturday morning was gray and still, the kind of quiet that settles over a neighborhood when most people are still inside. He gave me a file," Reed said. "Photos, background, professional information. He told me the charity event was a good venue because Claire's hospital unit was sponsoring a table and she would be there." A pause. He'd done a lot of preparation. I thought about a display table near the entrance of a venue downtown, and a glass of sparkling water, and a young man who had stayed to help rebuild what he had knocked over. "I went," Reed said simply. "I introduced myself the way you introduce yourself, when you've already read someone's background file and you're pretending you haven't. And she was." He stopped. He pressed his fingers flat against the table. "She was completely different from what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Someone easier to be calculating about. Maybe." He shook his head slightly. "She wasn't that." "When did it change?" I asked. "About 3 months in," he said. There wasn't a single moment. It was more like I kept waiting for the feeling of being on assignment to come back, and it stopped coming back. And then one evening we were sitting in her apartment and she was telling me about a patient she'd lost that week, and she wasn't performing grief, she was just sitting with it, the way she sits with hard things. And I thought, he stopped again. "You thought you were in trouble," I said. "Yes." He looked up. I knew by month 4 that I was going to have to choose between telling her the truth and losing her, or not telling her and spending the rest of my life knowing I hadn't. He exhaled slowly. I kept choosing the third option, which was to wait and hope something resolved it. I understood that particular logic. It was the logic of people who are not bad but are afraid, which is most people at their worst. "What changed this week?" I asked. Reed's expression shifted. Something harder came into it, not at me, but at a specific memory. I found an email on a shared server my father uses for internal communications. I wasn't looking for it, I was pulling a document for an unrelated project, and the folder was mislabeled. He set down the mug. It was between my father and the attorney who drafted the prenup. It laid out exactly what Section 14 was designed to do. Every step, the timeline, the mechanism, what it would transfer and when. The kitchen was very quiet. "I read it 3 times, Reed said. "And then I called you." He looked across the table at me with the expression of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is not certain their arms remember how to work without the weight. "I didn't know about the clause," he said. "I swear I didn't know. I knew my father had reasons for wanting the marriage to happen, financial reasons, and I told myself it didn't matter because by then it was real for me. But I didn't know what he had put in that document. I didn't know what he was trying to take. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. I didn't know it was about her father. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about Thomas's letter on my desk. "Don't be afraid to use everything we have." I thought about 3 notebook entries and 9 seconds of silence and a sealed envelope that had waited 6 years for the right moment. "I know," I said. Reed looked up. "I know you didn't know about the clause," I said. "That's why you're sitting in my kitchen instead of standing at the altar." Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular change that happens when someone has been bracing for impact and the impact doesn't come the way they expected. He came to confess. What he didn't know was that confession was only the beginning of what I needed from him. Reed left at 11:15. I walked him to the door and watched him get into his car and sit there for a moment before starting the engine. The particular stillness of someone who has just put down something heavy and is learning, in real time, what it feels like to stand without it. Then he drove away, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, and then I went inside and called my daughter. She arrived 40 minutes later. I had spent that 40 minutes making lunch that neither of us would eat, a habit carried over from the years of teaching, when the act of preparing food was the thing I did with my hands when my mind was working on something difficult. The sandwiches sat on the kitchen table, untouched, throughout the entire conversation. Claire came in the way she always came in, key in the lock, the particular rhythm of her footsteps in the hallway, the way she called out Mom while she was still removing her jacket. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, saw my face, and stopped. "What happened?" she asked. "Sit down," I said. "I need to tell you something." She sat. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, the same way she had at Arden when she was trying to stay composed, and she looked at me with the expression I had seen only a handful of times in her life, completely open, every defense lowered, prepared for something she already knew was going to be hard. I told her everything. I started at the beginning, not the dinner at Arden, not even Reed's visit that morning, but further back, the 3 notebook entries. The way Reed had known my name before being introduced, had known the name of your father's firm before anyone told him, had said Voss Capital Partners in my kitchen one January evening, as if it were something he had simply always known. I told her about the financial inquiry Marcus had received, about the Hargrove Group's debt structure and the acquisition they needed to close in 90 days, and the holding company name I had recognized in Section 3 of their financial profile. I told her about the envelope and what Thomas had written, and the 4 words at the bottom of the 3rd page. I told her about subsection 14b. I placed the prenuptial agreement on the table between us and turned to page 11 and pointed to the 9 lines that began, "In the event that the signing party is the beneficiary of an estate established by a deceased spouse." I read it aloud, slowly, the way I used to read difficult passages in class, not to perform them, but to make sure every word landed where it was meant to land. Claire did not move while I read. She did not look away from the page. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. She sat with it for a long time. I did not rush her. This was the kind of information that needed space not to be processed. Exactly, because some things cannot be processed in real time, but to be received, the way you receive something very heavy by planting your feet first. Finally, she said, "Reed came to see you this morning. He told you he knew about the clause?" "He told me he didn't know about the clause. He found an email between his father and the attorney who drafted it. He came to me before he came to anyone else." Claire looked at the table. "And you believe him?" I thought about Reed at 8:52 in the morning, sitting in her chair with his hands around a coffee mug, saying I didn't know it was about her father in the voice of someone who has just understood the full weight of something and cannot pretend otherwise. "Yes," I said. "I believe him." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something carefully rather than reacting to it. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for, the one that had been sitting underneath everything else since the moment I decided to tell her all of it today rather than tomorrow. Did he ever really love me? The kitchen light was steady and warm. Outside, the October afternoon had gone very still, no wind, no traffic, just the quiet particular to a Saturday in a residential neighborhood when most people are inside and the world has temporarily reduced itself to its smallest, most manageable scale. I looked at my daughter, at the face I had watched since she was born, at the 29 years of her that I knew better than I knew almost anything else, and I said what I actually believed. "I think the real question," I said, "is whether love that began wrong can become something real." Claire held my gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the prenuptial agreement still open on the table. "I'm not canceling the wedding," she said quietly. I waited. "I'm not canceling it because I'm not going to let them win by making me run." She looked up. "But I'm not walking into tomorrow pretending I don't know what I know." That was my daughter. Precisely, exactly, entirely my daughter. We sat without speaking for a while after that, the two of us, in the kitchen that had held 30 years of our family's ordinary life, in the particular silence of people who are on the same side of something and don't need to say so out loud. At some point, Claire reached over and placed her hand on mine. I turned my hand over and held it. Eventually, she looked up at me with the question I had known was coming since the moment she walked through the door. "What are you going to do, Mom?" I looked out the kitchen window at the bare maple tree, standing clean and still in the afternoon light, stripped to its essential shape. "What your father asked me to do," I said. We didn't speak for a long time after that, but when Claire finally stood up and squared her shoulders, I knew she was ready. The question was whether the Hargroves were... The coffee was ready before anyone arrived. I had been up since 5, which wasn't unusual for me, but that morning I wasn't awake because of worry. I was awake because there was work to do, and I have always been the kind of person who thinks more clearly in the hours before the rest of the world starts making noise. By the time pale light began filling the kitchen windows, I had already reviewed the documents Marcus had sent the night before, checked my notes from Thomas's letter twice, and written 3 pages in the Navy notebook that I promptly closed and set aside. Claire arrived at 7:45. She was dressed simply dark jeans, a cream sweater, her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she was focused on something. She walked into the kitchen, poured herself coffee without asking where anything was, and sat down at the table across from me. She didn't say good morning. Neither did I. We didn't need to. Marcus Webb arrived at 8 on the dot, which was exactly what I expected from him. He came with a leather document case and the quiet, measured energy of a man who had spent 30 years making sure things held together. He set his case on the table, accepted the coffee I offered, and opened without preamble. "Let's start with what we know for certain," he said. What we knew for certain was this. The shares Thomas had restructured into Voss Capital Partners 6 years ago remained legally in my name alone. The governance documents Thomas had updated during his final months contained a provision that required my written authorization and only mine for any transaction exceeding $50 million involving those assets. The M&A deal Robert Hargrove needed to close within the next few weeks fell well above that threshold. Without my signature, the deal could not proceed. Without the deal, the Hargroves faced a liquidity crisis that no amount of family legacy could paper over. Marcus laid the relevant pages out in front of us, side by side, and walked through each one slowly. Claire listened without interrupting. She had always been like that, the kind of person who waits until she understands the whole shape of something before she says a word. I watched her eyes move across the documents and recognized the expression on her face. It was the same one she used to wear in math class years ago when a problem finally clicked into place. When Marcus finished, she looked up. So they needed Mom's signature the whole time. They needed it and didn't know it, Marcus said. The inquiry Meridian Advisory sent 2 months ago suggests they were trying to determine whether the asset could be accessed another way. Through a marital estate, for instance, once Claire signed the prenuptial agreement. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They never asked her directly because they didn't know it was her." "Correct." She nodded slowly and looked at me. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to add. After Marcus finished the legal walkthrough, I excused myself to make a call I had been preparing for since Friday. The M&A partner I needed to reach was a woman I had worked with carefully over the past 2 years. Methodical, private, someone who understood that the most important deals were often the ones that happened quietly. I reached her on the second ring. "The authorization hasn't been submitted," she confirmed. "The window is still open, but it won't be for much longer. We're inside the final stretch." "I know," I said. "I'll be in touch before it closes." I came back to the kitchen and told Marcus and Claire what she had said. Marcus made a note. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and stared at the table for a long moment. We spent the next hour mapping out exactly how the following day would go, who would be where, what would be said, and at what point Marcus would be available by phone. He offered to be present in person, but I told him we wouldn't need that. What we needed from him was already done. The rest of it belonged to us. It was just past 10 when Marcus packed his documents and stood to leave. He paused at the kitchen doorway and looked at me the way he sometimes did with something that wasn't quite sentiment but was close to it. "Thomas would have liked this plan," he said. I thought about that for a second. He wrote most of it. Marcus smiled and left. Claire and I sat together for a while after that, not talking much, just occupying the same quiet. I refilled our coffee. She asked if I was nervous. I told her no, which was mostly true. What I felt wasn't nerves. It was the particular kind of stillness that comes when you've done everything you can do in advance, and the only thing left is to show up. At 11:15, my phone rang. Reed's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a moment, then handed it to Claire. She looked at me. "You sure?" "He deserves to say it to your face," I said, "and you deserve to hear it from him before tomorrow." She took the phone, answered, and walked into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen. I poured the last of the coffee and stood at the counter, listening to the house. From the other room, I heard the low murmur of voices, Reed's first, careful and steady, and then Claire's, which rose once and then settled. There was a stretch of quiet that felt long. And then, faintly, I heard Claire cry, not loudly, just briefly, the way you cry when something true finally lands. A few minutes passed, and then I heard something else. Her voice again, quieter, and underneath it the smallest sound of laughter, soft and reluctant and real. I set my mug down and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The maple tree Thomas had planted the year Claire was born had lost most of its leaves by now. The branches were bare and clean against the pale November sky. I didn't need to hear the conversation. The sound of my daughter's voice afterward told me everything. She had chosen to walk into tomorrow with her eyes open. That was all I had ever wanted for her. The wedding was beautiful. I want to say that plainly, because it was true, and because I think it deserves to be said before anything else. The venue was a restored estate on the east side of Nashville, high ceilings, tall windows, candlelight that pooled gold on every surface. Claire walked down the aisle in a dress she had chosen without anyone's input, and she was radiant in the way that only people who have made a true decision can be. Reed stood at the front of that room and watched her come toward him with an expression I had no trouble reading. Whatever else he had been at the beginning of this story, in that moment he was simply a man who understood how close he had come to losing everything that mattered. I sat in the front row and let the ceremony be what it was. The reception followed in the adjacent hall round tables with white linens, a band playing low in the corner, servers moving through the room with practiced ease. I found my seat, spoke to the people around me, ate the dinner that was placed in front of me, and waited. Because that is what the evening required. Patience and presence in equal measure, and the willingness to let things arrive in their own time. Robert Hargrove found me just before 9 o'clock. He had been working the room for most of the night, the way men like Robert always do at events like these, moving from table to table with a drink in hand and a handshake ready, performing the role of gracious host with the efficiency of long practice. When he arrived at my table, he dismissed the couple I had been speaking with using the particular kind of charm that functions as dismissal, and then he sat down beside me. "Eleanor," he said, "it's good to finally have a moment." "It is," I agreed. He made small talk for a few minutes, the venue, the ceremony, how well the two families had come together. I listened and answered appropriately and did not rush him. I have learned over the years that the most useful thing you can do when someone is building towards something is to let them build at their own pace. It tells you a great deal about who they are. Eventually, he set down his drink and leaned forward slightly. "I assume you've been briefed on the Voss Capital situation," he said. "The business side of things. We'd appreciate your cooperation in the coming days." I looked at him. "I'm aware of the situation, Robert," I said. "In fact, I've been aware of it longer than you have." Something shifted in his face, a brief recalibration, like a man who has stepped onto ground he expected to be solid and found it less certain than anticipated. He smiled anyway, because men like Robert default to the smile when they need a moment to think. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "Then we're on the same page." "We'll see," I said pleasantly. I excused myself shortly after, mentioning that I needed some air. The terrace outside the main hall was mostly empty. The night was cool and clear, and from where I stood I could see the lights of Nashville stretched out below the hill like a second set of stars. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, and then I took out my phone. The document was already prepared. Marcus had handled the technical details. All that remained was the authorization. I reviewed the terms one final time, not because I had any doubt, but because Thomas had taught me that the most important decisions deserve one last clear look before you commit to them. The conditions I had attached were specific and non-negotiable, and would become apparent to the Hargrove Group within the coming days. Tonight, the only thing that needed to happen was the signature. I pressed confirm. The screen acknowledged the submission. I stood on the terrace for another minute, watching the city lights below, and then I went back inside. The room was warm and loud with music and conversation. I moved through it without hurrying, nodding to the faces I recognized, and found Claire and Reed near the edge of the dance floor. Claire was laughing at something, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Reed had his hand at the small of her back. He saw me first. I watched his eyes ask the question. His mouth didn't form. "It's done," I said. Reed exhaled slowly. He nodded once, and in that nod was everything he understood about what the evening had cost and what it had required. Claire looked from him to me, and then she reached out and took my hand and held it for a moment without saying anything at all. We stood like that briefly, the three of us, in the middle of the room. Then the band shifted into something slower, and Claire pulled Reed onto the dance floor, and I stepped back to give them the space they had earned. I was standing near the far wall, watching the room, when I saw it happen. Robert Hargrove was across the hall, mid-conversation, when he reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. He glanced at the screen. I watched him read whatever was there. The conversation he had been having simply stopped. The person he'd been speaking to said something, and Robert didn't respond. He read the screen again. And then, slowly, he looked up. His eyes moved across the room until they found me. Robert Hargrove stood in the middle of his son's wedding reception and finally understood who had been sitting at his table all along. I didn't wait to see his expression. I had already turned back to my daughter. 6 months is not a long time, and it is also a lifetime. I have been thinking about that lately, the way time works differently depending on where you are standing inside it. The 6 months before the wedding felt like they lasted years. The 6 months after have moved the way good seasons do. Steadily, quietly, with the kind of forward motion that only becomes visible when you stop and look back. It is a Tuesday morning in May. Sandra is sitting across from me at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug, and the windows are open because the weather has finally decided to cooperate. There are birds in the maple tree Thomas planted. I have been noticing them more lately. "You're quieter than usual," Sandra says. "I'm thinking," I tell her. She reaches across the table and takes a piece of the coffee cake she brought, which is from the same bakery on Gallatin Avenue we have been going to since before either of us had any gray hair. Thinking about what? How things land, I say. Eventually. She considers that for a moment, then nods. Sandra has always understood the value of not pressing for more than what's offered. The M&A deal closed at the end of November, 11 days after the wedding. It went through on my terms, which were these: a full, independent audit of Hargrove Group's internal financials before the transaction finalized, to be conducted by a firm of my choosing, with findings disclosed to the acquiring partner. Marcus handled the legal mechanics. I stayed out of the headlines, because that was never the point. The audit found what I had suspected it would find. The irregularities in the Brentwood project, the Memphis shortfall, the pattern of debt positioned as asset in the partnership filings, it was all there, documented and delivered to the acquiring company in early December. Robert Hargrove stepped down as CEO before the year was out. The announcement cited a planned transition and used the language these announcements always use. The people who needed to understand what had actually happened understood it. That was enough. I did not feel triumphant when I read the news. I felt, if I am being honest, something closer to tired and resolved at the same time. The way you feel when a long task is finally finished and you can set down the weight of it without ceremony. Reed and Claire moved into a house in East Nashville in January, a 1940s bungalow with original hardwoods and a back porch that gets afternoon sun. I have had dinner there 4 times. Reed cooks, which I did not expect, and he is good at it. He and Claire have the particular ease of 2 people who know something about each other that most couples take years to learn. That love chosen consciously, after difficulty, is a different and more durable thing than love that simply happened. He told her everything before the ceremony, not because I arranged it, though I told him she deserved to hear it from him. He made that decision on his own, which is the only way it could have meant anything. Claire came to me afterward the night before the wedding, after Reed left, and we sat in the kitchen for a long time without needing to say very much. She was not naive about what had been. She simply decided it did not have to determine what came next. I think that was the bravest thing I watched her do. In February, I took Thomas's photograph down from the small shelf in my office, where it had been sitting where I had moved it some years ago, during a period when looking at it every day made the absence feel too immediate. I cleaned the frame carefully and walked it back to the hallway, to the nail it had hung on for most of our marriage. The wall had been repainted once since then, but the nail was still there. I hung it back up and stood there for a moment. There is a version of this story in which I am the one who did everything, who planned and prepared and executed and prevailed. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. What I had was Thomas's work, the provisions he put in place, the letter he wrote when he understood he was running out of time. He handed me a set of instruments and trusted me to know how to use them when the moment arrived. I have thought many times about what it cost him to prepare for a future he would not be in. I think it was an act of extraordinary love, and I try not to take it for granted. Do you ever wonder how it would have gone? Sandra asks. If you hadn't opened the envelope when you did? I have wondered that. I have wondered what would have happened if I had waited longer, or not waited at all if the wedding had come and gone before I understood the full shape of what the Hargroves were doing. I think about Clause 14b and the 12-month window it contained, and I think about how close it was. I think the timing was Thomas, I say. Sandra smiles at that. She refills her coffee and doesn't push it further. I look out the open window at the maple tree. The birds have gone quiet, and the morning light is coming in at the low angle it takes in May, warm and unhurried, falling across the floor the way it used to when Claire was small, and I would sit in this kitchen before the rest of the house was awake, just holding the stillness of it. Thomas wrote many things in that letter, but the line I return to most often is the simplest one. You'll know what to do when the time comes. He was right. I did. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you recognize something in Eleanor's patience, or in the weight of keeping a confidence until the moment it matters, I would be grateful if you shared it. These stories find the people who need them when enough of us pass them along. Thank you for being here until the end.